Thank you very much, Senator Gomes. Senator Schlossberg, Representative Fleischman, members of the committee, thank you very much. I'm the Executive Director of FairTest, the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, headquartered in Boston.
And could you please repeat your full name?
Yeah,
and
my name is Monty Neill. Our mission is to promote fair, open, and educationally beneficial evaluations of students, teachers, and schools. We also work to end the misuses and overuses and flaws of standardized testing. So thank you for inviting me to speak with you, because our view is that Connecticut should overhaul its testing policies. It should end reliance on the smarter balanced exams, which only assess a limited slice of what students should know and be able to do for success as adults. The tests remain mostly multiple choice and short answer. The performance tasks are too few and not based in any specific curriculum, which inevitably will help some students while hurting others. SBAC is not the assessment Connecticut needs to guide instruction or to adequately report on student and school progress. Continued reliance on tests like SBAC will particularly harm the most vulnerable groups of students, including African Americans, Latinos, English language learners, low-income students, and students with disabilities. The plan also correctly bars statewide testing in K-2. To the extent it can, Connecticut also should remove high stakes from standardized testing. Based on developments in other states, this now appears feasible despite No Child Left Behind. A multiple indicators approach is both doable and preferable. The state also should pressure Congress and its senators and representatives to reduce mandated testing and end test-based sanctions on schools and teachers. The CEA proposal, which they have given to you, provides for a far superior assessment program. It combines progress monitoring tests with district, school, and classroom-based assessments of the rich range of learning our youth need. These include critical thinking skills, creativity, the ability to collaborate and communicate effectively, self-direction in the pursuit of continued learning, and engagement in civic, community, and global issues. It also mandates that these new assessment systems address achievement gaps that may exist in each of these areas. There's no doubt that teachers can construct such assessments and ensure that they are reliable and valid. Teachers have done so with the highly successful New York Performance Standards Consortium, which I discuss in my written testimony, as well as in the state of Nebraska prior to NCLB, and are now beginning to do in New Hampshire. Importantly, the plan requires that the availability of resources be considered. Now, as resources are largely a state responsibility, FairTest US schools should not be held accountable for whether they have adequate resources, but certainly you should pay attention to how well they use the resources they have. Parents, students, and teachers across the nation are currently rising in rebellion against the overuse and misuse of standardized tests. Meanwhile, extensive evidence shows that high-quality assessment is a necessary component of teaching and learning, and most certainly the public deserves to know how well our schools are doing. Connecticut has the opportunity to curtail standardized testing and promote alternative assessments that will serve students, schools, and the community well. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm just wondering, for purposes of clarification, you've given a sense of the type of assessment model that you think most appropriate. Do you represent a group that actually offers certain types of assessments, or do you rather identify certain ones that are already in use that you believe are best for capturing the growth model you've described?
We do not market, sell, produce, or explicitly endorse specific assessments. What we've identified are successful models. The New York Performance Standards Consortium, what Nebraska was doing for nearly a decade before NCLB rather wiped it out. Something called the Learning Record, which is a specific assessment, but is not offered in it by any commercial enterprise at this time, and was very commonly used in Bureau of Indian Affairs schools until it too was wiped out by No Child Left Behind. So we identify different models and approaches to assessment that could be used.
Thank you. Well, your comments raise a point that was really going to be part of my follow-up question, which is we are preempted by federal law in the sense that we must provide certain annual assessments in certain years according to the version of ESEA known as No Child Left Behind. Given that federal mandate that's out there, are there models that you've identified that would withstand the scrutiny of the U.S. Department of Education as being in compliance with their requirements?
I think what the Connecticut Education Association has offered would do that. First of all, it would do the standardized assessment, the short ones, in every grade. That provides a certain level of statewide data that would meet the first part of the requirement of the federal law. The other parts are filled in by the local assessments that get at the richer thinking. There's an irony in the federal law which calls for assessing higher order thinking skills, but the tests don't do it. And the department has never bothered to actually insist it does it. Now, there is PR that Smarter Balance will do that. Our view is that it remains mostly multiple choice and is not really going to do that. I think when you put the two together, you can meet the current federal law. Our hope, and it's a possibility, that Congress will actually move to only requiring standardized statewide tests in 3 grades, elementary, middle, and high. We don't know if that's going to happen yet. It's on the table in Congress. If it does that, we would encourage Connecticut to follow suit. If it does not do that, what the CEA proposes would, I think, meet the requirements. Now, last point, New Hampshire just got a waiver. And it's starting on a pilot basis, but the goal statewide is they will use a state assessment in really just 3 grades, elementary, middle, and high, and fill in all the rest, excuse me, on performance assessments that are locally designed to meet the state standards. The pilot has been approved. Whether that would continue to end up being approved down the road remains to be seen. If it did not, spending a few hours a year on a limited test, such as the CEA proposed, could well fill in the blank there.
Just last question, and I know others have questions. So if you take that New Hampshire model that you referenced, or the CEA proposal that was put forward a few weeks ago, as I understand it, the reliance would be upon progress tests that are developed locally. Part of the impetus of reform that's gone on at the federal and state levels has been to try and ensure that a child in a school district at one end of the state is getting an education equal to a child at the other end of the state. What is New Hampshire doing? What could Connecticut do to ensure that comparability if we were to move to the model that you're describing?
Well, one set of the progress tests, the ones would be administered in essence statewide, the progress monitoring, and that would provide that statewide comparable data. The second piece is that the local assessments of creativity, ability to cooperate, critical thinking, and so on, would be done according to a set of standards that a commission would establish. I want to give you just for a moment, if I may, what they did in the state of Nebraska that I mentioned prior to NCLB. Under then Commissioner Christensen, they decided to develop a statewide system of local assessments. These were all designed at the local level, but they had to meet a set of state criteria for meeting the content standards, for validity and reliability, for being unbiased, and a set of others. Districts developed them. They were then evaluated independently by the Burroughs Institute for Mental Measurements at the University of Nebraska, a long-standing measurement shop. Districts that did not do it right had another year to do it, and if they still didn't do it right, they'd have to adapt something that had been approved in another district. I was out there a number of times looking at it, and what impressed me enormously was the great speed with which the teachers moved from basically doing things like multiple choice and matching tests with high reliability to actually using ongoing student work, projects, tasks, report, papers, and so on, and found ways to evaluate those reliably. Now, the state had testing, standardized testing at grades 4, 8, and 11 that provided statewide comparable data that was basically a mix of a norm reference test and writing to a prompt. So there are ways of checking up on the system to ensure the comparability while enabling the districts to dig really deeply and to link the assessment to the actual curriculum that students do, and therefore support their engagement and their interests, as well as ensure that they have attained the knowledge and skills they need to get.
Thank you. your description raises one last follow-up. So what you've described sounds like it would match the goals of the U.S. Department of Education currently. So if that's the case, why is that Nebraska system no longer permissible?
What I was told, and I'm repeating something that was said publicly by the commissioner, then Commissioner Christensen. Originally, 2 states were looking to design a system like Nebraska, Maine and Nebraska. Senator Collins from Maine asked then Secretary Page if that was going to be permissible, and he said yes. Maine in the end didn't go that route. Nebraska did. Page went out there a number of times, met with him, and looked at it. At one point he said, this really is the kind of system that states should build for No Child Left Behind. It appeared he was on the verge of giving approval, but then he resigned. Secretary Spellings, quite frankly, had a very different perspective. She would brook nothing other than a single statewide test. And they went to the mat. I mean, she kept asking him for materials they had already sent, just running them around in rings. That then dovetailed with a political debate in Nebraska, the impossibility of seemingly moving ahead with federal approval, and it basically killed it. And what Doug Christensen told me was, a few years ago, they started the conversation in Nebraska, we have a problem, we're not assessing the things we need to assess.
Thank you. Very helpful testimony.
Thank you.
Senator Schlossberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Neill. I really appreciate being here, and thank you, Senator Gomes. Welcome back. Appreciate you bringing up this expert to discuss this very important topic with us. You know, I have a lot of questions. I'm sure other people do. So very quickly, can you just the proposal that you have, can you compare that to SBAC in particular as it relates to students in high academic need?
Well, one of the things we've noticed around the country is with any of the standardized tests, you know, it's kind of like, you know, one size fits few. If you're wearing shoes and everybody has to wear a size 8, some people are in trouble. And that's kind of what happens with standardized tests. They sort of override everybody's particular interests, capabilities, cultures, whether it be individual or group, and try to standardize everything. And it just simply tends not to fit very well with a lot of kids. And kids who are at the margins, who aren't doing well in school, who come from backgrounds where they often have, frankly, not the best of relationships with their schools. Their parents might not have done well. That carries over. Those sort of issues make it harder to build a school around the things that engage students while simultaneously ensuring the proper academic outcomes when all the pressure is on to raise the stakes on a standardized test. Now, Smarter Balanced is another standardized test. It does have some performance tasks. The ones I've looked at, some look good, some don't look so good, and none of them necessarily fit anybody's particular curriculum. And there's only a couple of them. The rest is short answer and multiple choice, essentially. Now, the New York Performance Standards Consortium, if I can take a minute to describe it, they were approved more than a decade ago, well before No Child Left Behind, as a small group of public schools, public high schools, most in New York City. They graduate their students, they have to take one of the 5 Regents exams, the English Language Arts exam. Otherwise, they graduate students by extended performance tasks, one in language arts, one in math, one in science, one in history. The students pick their own tasks. It usually goes out of classroom work, but it has to meet the teacher's approval of being something that would be worthy of demonstrating your capacities, that you deserve a diploma. When it is done, it is defended before a committee that always includes at least one outside expert, often from a university, Columbia, Rockefeller, CUNY. When approved, then the student's done. Now, the question becomes, well, how well do these students do? So they did a detailed study 2 years back of 28 New York City schools. They're up to 40-some now. The regents like what they did, so they give them the right to expand. And the consortium, their student body literally mirrors demographically New York City as a whole. The average kid comes in with lower test scores than the New York City average. Their graduation rate is higher than the city average. It's about double the city average for students with disabilities and English language learners. It is higher for African Americans and Latinos. Of that higher percentage of graduates, they send a significantly higher percentage on to college. Very good. What's particularly fascinating is that the percentage of students still in college in semester 3 and beyond exceeds the national average, which includes all the suburban kids, all the wealthy kids, the middle class kids, and so on. In short, in the real world, they do real well. Now, on standardized tests, their scores go up some. They tend to pass the language arts exam. but they've been able to construct an assessment system that gets the kids to collaborate, to display creativity, to certainly demonstrate critical thinking, persistence, because they got to work at it. And if it's not right the first time, they have to go back and do it again. Not everybody graduates the first time around. So that's the kind. Now, this was designed entirely by the teachers. And it shows to me that teachers can do this, much as Nebraska showed. They can do it. And in time, fairly quickly, they get significantly better. So if districts in Connecticut had that capacity, they would be charged with building the assessments, and they could collaborate and learn from each other, which might be a very smart move, that would complement those rather limited, basically multiple choice performance assessments that also track progress. So when you do this, and the students are doing this kind of work, you can see their progress in every subject area, their capacity to move from shorter papers to longer papers, to do a more rich investigation in history, et cetera.
So does this system allow you, though, to then make comparison between schools and between school districts as to how students are doing?
Well, what they do with the New York Consortium, the schools in it score the students by a common scoring guide or rubric. So all the students are judged by the same guide. What they do every year is sample from the student completed tasks and rescore them blind and independently and provide that as feedback. So the goal is to keep everybody within a reasonable ballpark. Can you do that statewide? Yes. For example, the CEA bill says the standards and the scoring guides would be state centralized. So then the question would be, how do you set up a way of sampling to make sure that you've got some consistency? They never did that in Nebraska. Frankly, I think they should have. And again, you also have the progress monitoring assessments that provide another check on the system. There's another component that Connecticut could think about and perhaps use on a more limited basis, particularly where the evidence suggests a school might not be doing so well, and that's the school quality review teams. They're historically Her Majesty's Inspectorate in England, dating from the middle of the 19th century. Holland uses them, New Zealand uses them. Rhode Island was using them. These things are subject to political vagaries. A new superintendent came in and she kind of killed what was going on, although the evidence was they were providing good feedback and rich information for schools that needed to get better.
And I just have one last question for you. I'm interested in learning more about this, but I think one of the big issues is that we're talking about today and otherwise in terms of tests becoming, these very high pressure tests. It sounds like, with progress monitoring and some other, locally developed test or statewide developed test, how do you prevent that from still turning into a high pressure, high stakes test for our students?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that help. I mean, first off, Connecticut has an NCLB waiver, so that removes a good deal of the pressure on most of the districts, but still is the issue of identifying districts that are not doing well. I think with multiple sources of evidence, rather than a simple ranking based on test scores, you can actually find out which districts or schools most need help and provide that assistance. And that would then become help rather than the sort of punitive feel to No Child Left Behind. I think the other complicated story, and so I think, in other words, there's a way out of the pressure on the schools. What is more problematic is, what do you do about teachers? And I think the rebellion, frankly, in many states against the way the waivers are requiring the evaluation of teachers and the steady backtracking of the U.S. Department of Education suggests that this is going to go away as a problem fairly soon. And we can have a rational approach to taking a good evaluation process of teachers that's not instantly high stakes and not rooted in the kind of tests that frankly don't tell us much with the U.S. Statistical Association said don't do this. The measurement profession says this is a bad idea. So I think we ought to pay attention to those experts and say, let's move away from that. And I think increasingly the feds are simply backing off. They know it's not working.
Okay. Thank you very much for very helpful answers, and we appreciate you being here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I just want to thank you for letting me be a part of bringing Dr. Neill before you.
I don't think you're
Thank you, but there's still another question for Dr. Neill. And Senator, you can remain up there or move along as you see
Right
fit.
here. I
Senator-
enjoy the view.
Terrific. Senator Bartolomeo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of you for being here. Dr. Neill, it seems as though every few months I hear different statistics about the Smarter Balance test or other similar tests being utilized for Common Core throughout the nation. And I wonder, can you give us a feel right now for what's happening in other states as far as choosing to do these Common Core standardized assessments, those that choose and then change and pull out, and those that are using the performance standards? Do you have a feel for nationally what that looks like?
Well, in terms of the Common Core standards, those seem to be sticking. Some states are literally renaming them and tinkering with them a little bit. There seems to be very few states that didn't adopt them or simply want to ditch them. There may be some more that ditch them depending on the politics and legislatures around the country this year. The tests are another story. Essentially, more than half the states in PARC dropped out, and almost half the states in Smarter Balanced have dropped out. They just simply don't want to do them. Now, all the states are required to have statewide assessments, and if you have a waiver, those are supposed to do, college and career readiness. And so what we're seeing is that, so ACT has developed a test that a few states are using. Other states are developing their own at this point, and some of them are actually taking pieces of Smarter Balanced and PARC. So the interesting examples that sort of run a little counter are New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire's using, and I don't remember, I think it's Smarter Balanced, but they really only want to use it in 3 grades. And like I said, they have a waiver to do that in the pilots at this point. And they're saying using that in 3 grades would be an acceptable use of a standardized test, but we think we can do much deeper and richer. So the question is, some states are already interested in that. What I've been hearing is a lot of states were waiting to see what would happen with New Hampshire. Vermont had asked, they essentially got told no earlier, but they wanted to jump immediately to just 3 grades. They were told, no, you won't get a waiver, so they didn't even ask for a waiver. But now that this has happened, they're likely to get back in the mix. California is increasingly looking at alternatives. They designed a whole community-based accountability system of which testing is one small part, and they're now beginning to address what to do with the testing. Now, they're committed right now to Smarter Balanced, but there's been a history in California and a push of looking at other kinds of classroom-embedded assessments. Will that be back on the agenda? I suspect so. So there are, and again, New York, which currently has its own test and may go to PARC, but they have allowed the New York Consortium to expand from 28 to about 48 high schools in 1 year. And the consortium, they don't want to go any faster than that because they want to make sure they get it right. But you could have other consortia forming and developing these things. I think the field is getting wide open now, and one of the interesting things with Smarter Balanced and PARC is that the debates over them have really raised questions about what does it mean to assess well. And so I'd refer you to the Gordon Commission. Edmund Gordon was a Yale, very prominent psychologist, and he founded a commission to look at the Smarter Balanced and PARC tests, and that commission, full of national luminaries in measurement and education, said, yeah, they're a little bit better, but not much, and they're really not what we need if we want to have in-depth assessments of our students.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, if I could ask a final question through you. Do you have the ability to assess whether or not CEA's proposal for testing in the state, would the financial aspect, would there be a cost to that? Would there be a savings to that? How does that play out?
It's one of those savings and not savings. The savings would be that the progress monitoring tests are a lot cheaper, about 1/3 the cost of what Smarter Balanced would cost. So a bunch of money would be saved there. The design of the local assessments would have to become part of teachers' ongoing work. So that's not free. But then neither is all the time they spend on testing and test prep, which in Colorado, a survey said up to 30% of teachers' time is now spent on testing and test prep, except that's not learning time. When you get involved in these deeper assessments that are project-oriented, you have a lot more serious learning going on that you really don't get with the test prep approach. Now, how do you account for that? Nebraska built its system with essentially no money. They didn't have the money to give the districts to design these, so they made it part of what teachers did as part of their work. Yeah, that means districts have got to figure out how to do it. And not all of them will be necessarily happy, but in the long run, you'll end up with much better assessments. Assessment should be an ongoing part of what teachers do. In fact, it is, because they do assessing all the time in the classroom. This is an additional piece and collaboration across classrooms. So there's a cost there. There might be some professional development time, some subs needed at times and so on. I don't have a cost estimate for you, but I suspect it's ballpark and could readily be done.
Actually, I'm sorry, I don't know if I was clear. I actually meant in comparison to the plan to use the Smarter Balance tests.
Well, you know, I would say the immediate direct costs of buying the assessments would be about a third. But the development costs would be a question of teacher time, but there's a good serious teacher time in the Smarter Balanced as well. Thank you.
Any other questions for the witnesses? If not, thank you both for your time and your patience. And
Thank
Dr.
you
Neill, I
very
have to
much.
tell you, you're the most optimistic person about flexibility and progress coming from Washington, D.C. that I've heard in about 10 years. So I appreciate your
Fingers
optimism.
crossed.
I'm not sure I share it, but I appreciate it.